This is part 3 of the chapter 4 lecture notes. We left off, we were talking about connective tissue proper, which is one of 3 types of connective tissue. So just for review, the 3 types of connective tissue are connective tissue proper, in which there are loose and dense connective tissue proper. And then the second type is fluid connective tissue, and the third is supporting connective tissue. So let's look. Okay, so I'm sorry I got interrupted. I think we were at elastic fibers, and they are for elasticity. And then reticular fibers are actually made of collagen, but they're very, very thin, and they're branching. And you find these in organs like the liver and the spleen and the kidney, where you have reticular tissue, which is kind of a thicker tissue. It's kind of mushy. So also lymph nodes and bone marrow is where you find these. Okay, so ground substance. So the connective tissue fibers and the ground substance together make up the matrix of connective tissue, and the ground substance is can be anywhere from, in connective tissue proper, it's a clear, colorless, and syrupy ground substance, whereas in bone it's a very hard, solid ground substance, and in blood it's fluid. So the ground substance can be different consistencies depending on what type of connective tissue that it's found in. Now, back to connective tissue proper, which is our first type of connective tissue. In connective tissue proper, the connective tissue can be loose or it can be dense. And the loose connective tissue proper is going to be areolar connective tissue, adipose connective tissue, and reticular connective tissue. The areolar connective tissue, generally what it does, it fills spaces between organs and provides cushioning. It supports epithelial tissue, so a lot of times you'll find it underlying the epithelial tissue. Underneath the epidermis, in the skin, is a layer called the dermis, and the top layer of the dermis is areolar connective tissue. In fact, most of the dermis is areolar connective tissue. So that would be underneath the epidermis, which is, if you remember, stratified squamous epithelial tissue. Then you have adipose, which is fat tissue, and it's going to be for insulation, protection around organs like the heart and the kidneys. It's going to be found under the skin in the hypodermis or subcutaneous layer, and the breast tissue is very fatty, so it's adipose tissue. The reticular connective tissue can be found in soft organs like the lymph nodes, the spleen, the bone marrow, the liver. Here are some pictures of those 3 connective tissues that we just talked about. Areolar connective tissue has all 3 fiber types, and it has all of the cell types that we learned, the fibrocytes, the macrophages, mast cells, and then the adipose tissue is filled with adipocytes or fat cells, and they are filled with fat. And reticular tissue has all those branching fibers in it. So, and you see the liver is used as an example here for where you can find reticular tissue. Then with connective tissue proper, we covered the 3 types of loose connective tissue proper. Now we're going to cover the dense connective tissue proper. And there are 2 types. There's dense irregular and dense regular. Okay, the dense regular connective tissue is going to be tendons and ligaments primarily. Tendons connect muscle to bone, and ligaments connect bone to bone. And the dense irregular is found in the dermis, but it's found in the deep dermis. That means it's found not close to the epidermis, but the layer of the dermis that is further away from the epidermis. The layer of the dermis that's close to the epidermis, so this is the epidermis, the part above this wavy line here. All this is the epidermis. And then from here to here is the dermis. Well, the upper part of the dermis is areolar connective tissue, but the deep or lower part of the dermis is dense, irregular connective tissue. And it provides strength to the skin. And here you have, for dense, regular connective tissue, you have the tendons and the ligaments. Tendons attach muscle to bone, and ligaments connect bone to bone, and they are dense, regular connective tissue. Now we're moving on to the fluid connective tissue, and that includes blood and lymph. Blood and lymph. The matrix for blood is called plasma. It's a fluid matrix. And the proteins, instead of protein fibers, you're going to have dissolved proteins. So you won't have collagen or elastin or reticular fibers. You'll have dissolved proteins in the matrix of blood and lymph. In blood, the matrix is plasma, and the cells are red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets, which are cell fragments. Then we go on to the supporting connective tissues, which are cartilage and bone. Cartilage and bone are the two types of supporting connective tissue. The cells of cartilage are called chondrocytes. Chondro means cartilage, cyte means cell. So this word literally means cartilage cell. And each chondrocyte, or mature cartilage cell, is found inside of a pocket called a lacuna. Cartilage is different from bone because it does not have a blood supply. It's avascular. So there is a limited ability for cartilage to repair itself if it's damaged. The covering of cartilage is called the perichondrium. And the types of cartilage are hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is found at the ends of bones that connect at a joint. So, for example, this bone that the cursor is moving around is called the humerus, or the upper arm bone, and the cartilage at the end of that bone that protects it from rubbing up against the shoulder blade or the collarbone, that cartilage is hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage can be found in the ear, the outer ear, and then the disc between the vertebrae, intervertebral disc, are made of fibrocartilage. The notes on hyaline cartilage: it's the most common type. It reduces friction between bones. It's located at the ends of bones that connect at synovial joints. These are movable, freely movable joints. We also have cartilage, rings of cartilage that line the upper respiratory tract, the trachea and the bronchi. An elastic cartilage is found in the external ear, in the epiglottis, which is the structure that closes over your trachea whenever you swallow so that food doesn't go down your windpipe. And then fibrocartilage, there's pads of fibrocartilage within knee joints. They're called the meniscus or menisci. There's the pubic symphysis that's found between the pubic bones. And then there's the intervertebral disc. So the fibrocartilage is the toughest type of cartilage. Then we have bone or osseous tissue, which is highly vascularized. The cells of bone tissue are called osteocytes. Osteo for bone and cyte for cell. They're located just like the chondrocytes. They're located within lacunae. Compact bone is arranged in units of bone called osteons. What I'm circling here is one osteon. And you can see that it's layers of bone tissue. And in between those layers, sandwiched in between those layers, these little slanted cells are called osteocytes. And the osteocytes reside within lacunae. Identify several functions of connective tissues. Well, we said a lot of functions. There's the fluid connective tissue. Blood, for example, transports nutrients and other substances throughout our body. The connective tissue proper acts as packing material and serves to reduce friction in some cases, supports underlying epithelial tissue. The three types of connective tissues are connective tissue proper, fluid connective tissue, and supportive connective tissue. Which type contains primarily triglycerides or fat? That would be adipose connective tissue. Lack of vitamin C in the diet interferes with the ability of fibroblasts to produce collagen. What effect might this interference have on connective tissue? Well, almost all connective tissue has some collagen in it. The exceptions would be the fluid connective tissues, but all the other types have collagen in them. So they definitely wouldn't be able to form, and they wouldn't be able to, or they wouldn't be able to repair, if they were damaged. Which two types of connective tissue have a fluid matrix? That would be blood and lymph. The two types of supporting connective tissue are cartilage and bone. And why does cartilage heal more slowly than bone? Because it is avascular. All right, I was just checking where we were. And then we have a section on tissue membranes. And I've talked about these a little bit. There are 4 types of tissue membranes. There are mucous membranes, which you find, for example, lining the respiratory tract, lining the urinary tract, the digestive tract, reproductive tract. Then there are serous membranes, and serous membranes are found lining the heart, the lungs, and the abdominal cavity. They're very delicate membranes. Then we have synovial membranes, which line joints, freely movable joints, and the cutaneous membrane is the skin. Excuse me. And here it says mucous membranes line passageways that open to the exterior. Digestive, respiratory, urinary, and reproductive tracts are lined with mucous membranes. And basically they produce mucus for protection. They can be composed of various types of epithelial tissue, but the connective tissue that underlies the epithelial tissue is typically areolar, and that connective tissue layer of areolar connective tissue is called the lamina propria. Serous membranes consist of 2 layers. Basically, I was going to see if they had a picture of it, but they don't. There is the layer that actually contacts the organs. Like if we're looking at the serous membrane that covers the heart, which is called the pericardium. The visceral layer actually touches the heart. Then there's a parietal layer that is separated from the visceral layer by a space that contains fluid, serous fluid. So the parietal layer does not actually touch the heart. The tissue is simple epithelium, simple squamous epithelium, and underneath that is areolar connective tissue for the serous membranes. And there are 3 serous membranes: the pleura, which lines pleural cavities, the parietal pleura lines the pleural cavities, and then the covering of the lungs is the visceral pleura. The peritoneum, the parietal peritoneum lines the peritoneal cavity or the abdominal cavity, and the visceral covers the abdominal organs. And then the pericardium covers the heart, the visceral part covers the heart, and the parietal part lines the pericardial cavity. Then we have the cutaneous membrane, which we also call the skin, and it is composed of stratified squamous epithelial tissue, and the connective tissue is areolar tissue and dense irregular connective tissue.